welcome to our November GPN Speaker Series event. And today we have Dr. Emilie Bagby from Mathematica. Dr. Bagby and I had the chance to meet at CIEF back in the spring, and I thought she would be a wonderful guest for us. She leads a team, she's Director of Global Education at Mathematica, and she's going to be talking about some really interesting methodological approaches that actually come from some recently published work. So I'm going to hand it over now to Dr. Bagby.
Thank you, Andrew. Dr. Bagby, take it away.
All right. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here. Please do feel free to interrupt if you have any clarifying questions, although I know that at the end of the session, we'll have quite a good amount of time for some Q&A. So today, I'd like to talk about rapid cycle evaluation and using different methods to improve program design and delivery. I'll talk about the methodological approaches, and then I'll discuss a case study from a project that focuses on foundational literacy in Senegal. And I know this is a youth-focused network, but these methods are relevant across the board, and foundational literacy, honestly, is really important, is an important theme when we're thinking about youth development today and where youth are globally. So I'll talk a little bit about that too. Okay, let me get this going. All right, first, I work for Mathematica. We are an employee-owned research and data analytics consultancy. We're mission-driven. Our focus is to bring evidence to bear on pressing social problems, social questions, social challenges. We grew in the United States. We have over 1,800 employees. We do a lot of work domestically, but we also have a lot of work going on internationally right now, collaborating with different government, philanthropic, academic, and private partners to generate and use evidence. We are very flexible and adapt our approaches based on priorities and landscapes, right? So we have a bunch of economists, right, like myself, that like our quantitative studies, and we have sociologists and qualitative research experts and measurement experts. And so we're able to bring a nice set of methodological tools to the table to answer the pressing questions at hand. Our portfolio of projects, including in education and workforce, spans the globe. Some of our current projects in that sector globally include those funded by Generation, by the Global Partnership for Education, by the Hilton Foundation, the Jacobs Foundation, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and USAID. So that's the world we're talking about now. So our portfolio in the education and workforce space really spans the spectrum, right? And so we conduct measurement, evaluation, research, and learning, so MERL, across the education continuum, right? From early childhood education through primary, secondary, TVET, tertiary education, as well as livelihoods projects and youth development projects. And we will bring a range of technical and methodological expertise to the table to be able to generate research questions, design studies that are fit for purpose, and then answer those questions to support policy making and decision making. I've been with Mathematica since completing my PhD in economics in 2011. I have focused my career here in human capital formation, right, in education and workforce. And I have worked in Latin America, in West Africa, mostly Francophone West Africa, in Southeast Asia, doing work across the spectrum. And so I'm very interested in youth and youth development, but also sort of what does it take to set youth up for success, right? So what's happening beforehand in primary education as well to get youth there. Did somebody have a question?
No, it was totally an accident.
Okay, great. All right, so hold on. All right, so now I'd like to talk about a chapter that I co-authored with Anu Rangarajan that is in the recently published, so 2003, the Oxford Handbook of Program Design and Implementation Evaluation. So the handbook showcases a set of papers that look at how we can improve the impact of social programs through a comprehensive approach to design and evaluation. And this chapter that I'm talking about talks about different approaches and evaluation methods, right? For design and delivery, right? But the overall handbook covers process evaluations, impact evaluation, right? Like a whole range of evaluations, and it's a really nice tool with lots of wonderful case studies. So I put the link in here in case anybody's interested in taking a look at the handbook overall. All right, so what is rapid cycle evaluation? It's really taking a systematic and iterative approach to facilitate learning around different programmatic elements. And we're bringing the ideas to bring different evaluation methods to the table and using them rapidly and iteratively to diagnose challenges, to identify facilitators to implementation and take up, and then to test potential solutions, right? So this fits within the overall implementation research world, right? But the idea here is let's bring these evaluation methods to the table and iterate, right? At early stages or even during design, let's use different methods to identify different operational choices that can maximize the chances of success. We can use it during implementation. If the program, as we're monitoring a program, if we don't seem to be achieving desired results, we can say, what's going on? Let's test, right? Let's do some foundational research, figure out what we think is happening, test a few different approaches to see if we can improve take up or other things. And then we can use it to test short-term effectiveness of programs, right? Or when we want to take a program to scale, do a study rapidly and then go to scale, or then when we're seeking to adapt successful implementation effort in a different context. So we know a model might have worked somewhere else. We've adapted it to a new context, but we want to do some studies before we actually scale it or wait 5 years to sort of see the effects of the program, right? So the idea here is to go rapidly. Now, when I'm talking rapid, right, it can have a range of meetings, right? We can talk about a few weeks, a few months, or even a full school year. Right? Oftentimes evaluations of programs might wait 2-3 years to see the effects of a program. Here, the idea is to look before the end of the contract or before the very end to see, are we meeting our early goals? Is the program doing what we expect it to do early on, depending on where you are in the theory of change, measuring what's happening. Cycle can reflect repeating the same approach over and over or varying your approach as you go and as you learn. And then, of course, evaluation is a broad term to bring different methods to the table. And it really is useful to maximizing impact of a program, right? As well as to improving processes and procedures that you might be using to carry out implementation. So the steps in rapid cycle evaluation. First, we need to understand the problem that we have and identify any potential solutions. This requires really close collaboration between the evaluator or researcher, the implementer, as well as the funder and other key stakeholders in a program, right? Step 2 is to then say, okay, we understand the problem. We have some ideas of how to solve it. Now let's test and figure out the approach that we want to take to testing. Step 3 is to actually carry out the test, collect the data. Step 4, analyze the data. Step 5, learn from the test and make changes based on it, and then iterate and go through this again if and when it makes sense to iterate. So let's go into each one of these in more detail. So first, when we're understanding the problem, as an evaluator or researcher, you might be thinking, okay, well, what questions do stakeholders have about the program, right? What is the implementing partner unsure about when they're making design decisions or when they're thinking about implementation and rollout and figuring out how to carry out the program? There's always decisions at every single step along the way. And oftentimes it's, well, we've done this before and we know that it works. But sometimes it's, we've done this before, we think that it's going to work here, but we're not really sure. And so maybe we want to do a little test here to sort of figure out what's happening, right? So we can do this during design, during implementation, take up, and then to look at the effects. There's other actors that are implicated in the program, right? Such as the Ministry of Education or other key stakeholders that might be involved, right? And what are things that they're unsure about? Or also where do they need to see evidence such that they can make a decision, whether it's a low stakes decision in the short term or a higher stakes decision about, how they're going to set up their budget for implementation. You can use it. We also can look at M&E indicators and say, well, are they moving as expected? If they're not, what's going on? And we want to dig in, right? So I'd love it if everybody could take a second right now to think about a place or a time where you've been in a situation where you've been understanding a problem and you've either wanted to help improve implementation or you've been studying something and said, wait a minute, I wish I would have thought about this earlier during implementation because I'm not really sure what's going on here, right? What were some of the issues? And if you have any thoughts you want to just pop into the chat, I think getting your thinking about where about this now can maybe help in as we move forward through this talk and then support the discussion at the end. So if you have any thoughts you want to pop into the chat, that would be great. So in terms of identifying potential solutions, once we've sort of thought through the problem, one thing that is very useful is the theory of change. We can sit down to think about potential program improvements as we walk through the theory of change. And we also can think about the outcomes that we should be measuring for the rapid cycle evaluation by using the theory of change, right? We know the activity we're engaging in. We know the inputs we're providing. We know that at the end of the day, we want to improve learning or social emotional outcomes or employability, right? Or employment. But what are the outcomes that are happening along the way, whether they're short-term outcomes, such as a change in teacher or instructional practices, or maybe graduation from a program, or maybe skills formation, right, before we go. So using that theory of change and thinking through the steps from your activities to your ultimate goal or outcome can be very helpful in figuring out what outcomes we should be measuring. Because when we're thinking about rapid cycle evaluation, we want to typically measure earlier outcomes, right? Things that are happening earlier in the theory of change that'll tell us, yes, we're on the path to success and we are going to reach our goal. Qualitative research can be really helpful in understanding and identifying barriers to and facilitators of implementation or participation or take up. And it can help identify solutions as well. And then program monitoring data can really help us to track where the program may be falling short of what was planned or places where we're being particularly successful, right? And it can help us to identify areas where additional learning is needed. Right, so once we've figured out our problem and we have ideas of potential solutions, now we need to design the approach we're going to use to test, right? Our approach should take into account both the nature of the research questions that need to be addressed, and the necessary level of confidence in the finding, right? So we want to know, is this something where we need a really large sample with an RCT in order to make a decision? Or can we talk to, I don't know, 10 people, 30 people along the way to help us with our iterative decision making that we're going along the way, right? So how much data, right? And what kind of study is really needed to help us answer? And then we really need to understand the options for obtaining and using data, right? Oftentimes we're doing this in a context where we have limited funding, right? It's during implementation and we want as much of the funding to go to implementation as possible. So what kind of data exists that we can use to help us glean information, or what additional data can we collect on, efficiently, maybe smaller samples to help us answer what we want. And then the time frame in which learnings need to be generated. So are we at the start of one school year and we want to make a decision for the second half of the school year? Well, that's a short time frame and we need to get our data relatively quickly. Or are we at the start of the school year or mid-school year and we want to make a decision for the next school year, for the next cycle, right? And we have a little bit more time to wait and to get the information. So again, thinking back to the problem you were talking about earlier, I'd love it if you could think right now about some methodological approaches that you would consider using. If you were in this case where you have some issues that you found and you're thinking about a design, are there any particular approaches that you would bring to the table that you're comfortable with, that you know about, that you would say, you know what, this can help answer a question? If you could share that in the chat now, that would be great. I'm not going to call on anybody. We'll talk about it later on at the end. But if there's anything that comes to mind as you're saying, yeah, this could be a good way to find an answer to generate evidence for decision making, I'd love it if you could share it in the chat. All right, so I've talked about different methods, right? And so this is a imperfect graphic that tries to illustrate sort of the trade-offs that we have when we're thinking about different methodological choices. So on the vertical axis, we're talking about the degree of certainty or attributability, right? So if we're thinking about a large sample, large scale RCT, right? We're really confident in the results at the end of it, maybe, right? On the x-axis, we're talking about feasibility and ease of implementation. So if we go all the way to the right here, maybe we're thinking about usability testing, where we go and we spend 2 weeks in the field or 2 weeks with some folks and have them sort of show us, see if they can use the thing that we're delivering, whether it's, a new software, a new tool that teachers might be using in the field. And then of course we have the range of studies in between, right? So we can use different optimization approaches, small sample RCTs, A/B testing, right? Descriptive research, outcome tracking, implementation studies. The chapter goes into detail on all of these, and I'll talk about some of them and some examples that I'm going to talk about shortly. All right, step 3. We've done our design. We've started to implement. Now we want to think about data collection, what that's going to look like, right? So ideally, we use administrative or existing program data, right? Using data that are already generated by the system or the program is ideal, and as they often allow for multiple rounds of testing, right? Examples of such data could be school records or other data collected that are regularly collected for program participants, right? Oftentimes we can modify, tweak, right, the plans for a program's data collection plans to incorporate small changes at low cost to assist with data collection of the RCE, right? So we can do short survey data, right? Short targeted surveys, right? The sample should be credible to support learning, but small samples using probabilistic approaches or purposive sampling really will often serve the needs of the study. We don't need to represent necessarily the full population when we're doing a small scale test. Lot quality assurance sampling can be used as well to get a representative sample of the population with a pretty small sample size, right? And of course, qualitative data are very useful to understand the how, the why, the what's, the details of what's going on. So then we have our data. We want to analyze our data, right? Doing descriptive analysis, tracking outcomes. If we have counterfactual or comparison approaches, we want to compare things. And we want to do our standard qualitative analysis here. I don't have a lot of words on the screen because it's all the same methods that we've all learned about in our courses, right? We're bringing to bear using the design that we've set up. And once we've done our analysis, right, and we know the hypotheses we came in with, we know what we're looking for, then we want to say, okay, well, what can we learn from this? And this is a really important step, right? Is saying, well, okay, the whole point was to generate learning that is actionable for a program, right? So we want to both interpret the data as researchers, but we want to support the decision makers to interpret the data as well. So it's not just my takeaways from the data from the study that I ran. It's also the implementing partners' takeaways or the ministry's takeaways or other stakeholders, right? So we want to discuss the learnings that we found, right? The basic analysis, and we want to improve the analysis as it makes sense, right? And we can do workshops to do this. We can have iterative feedback, sessions to sort of present findings and then get feedback. We really want to make sure that when we're doing this as researchers, we keep it, the tests and the findings simple and intuitive, so that way they can be understood by a broad array of stakeholders that are then going to need to make changes based on this. And then we might need to make it use iteration, right? We might need to say, well, we learned this from this study, but there's this other question that's now popped up in our mind. So we have to repeat the test or we have to tweak the test to continue moving forward. All right, so that was theoretical. Let's go into the example, right? The case studies, right? So I'm gonna, the chapter has more details on what I talked about, but I'd really like to go into the examples because I think this really brings to light what we're talking about here. So I'm gonna use a study that I implemented that's focused on foundational literacy. Why foundational skills, right? So basic reading, math, social emotional skills are needed in order to develop higher order skills. I saw a really nice graphic in a recent World Bank blog that sort of talks about this. I think everybody here probably knows this and understands this quite well. But if we can't read or do basic math, it's really hard to learn some of those higher order things that we might be learning in a TVET program or something later on, right? And we know that there is a systematic failure in many countries around the world where a lot of young people are reaching secondary education or coming to accelerated learning programs without basic foundational skills. So really helping kids learn to read, have basic math skills, and have foundational social emotional skills, I think is really just fundamentally important, whether we're talking about 9-year-olds or teenagers or even young adults. Okay, and we know that enrollment does not necessarily mean learning, right? And so there's been a big focus on foundational skills in the global community now, and I really appreciate that, as well as on implementation research. So let's talk about this example. So this is a case for the Lecture pour tous, so all children reading program in Senegal. That was a USAID funded technical assistance program to the Ministry of Education over 5 years. It ended in 2021. Chemonics was the lead implementer and had a suite of partners that they worked with, including international and local partners. It was implemented at scale in schools across about half of the country, so public schools across about half of the country. And the focus was to teach reading in national languages in the early grades, so grades 1 through 3. And there was a focus on instruction delivery systems, and then there was a piece that had a focus on engaging parents and community in learning. So learning by the project and USAID during implementation was of key interest. So we, a team of us under the rapid feedback MERL mechanism, that is a USAID mechanism that is now closed, but Mathematica was the technical lead, subbing to results for development for this. So we ended up having a 4-year engagement to generate learning for program improvement there. And we covered 3 themes. So information and communication technology with teachers and school principals, learning around teacher coaching with the new curriculum during the school year, and then learning around community and parent engagement around reading at the home. So there were 3 sets of RCEs that we conducted, and I'll talk about each one of those here. So the first one is around information and communication technology, so ICT, with teachers and school principals, okay? So the learning questions that the implementing partner had was really around whether or not teachers and school principals could appropriately use and apply the information that they learned, right, in their roles through the different ICT that the program was delivering, including SIM cards. So these are cards that they could put into their existing phones to get information, to make phone calls, right, to send messages, et cetera, et cetera. There was a friends and family plan, so that way teachers could contact each other and their directors, and basically within the ministry, anybody that had one of these SIM cards could contact each other for free, right? They weren't paying additionally to do this. And then they received messages, so push SMS coming from the program with reminders on different technical content or things that they wanted to do or that they should be doing as a part of the project. And so the question was really sort of, if people are having challenges with this, why and what can be improved, right? So we think it's going to work, and we expect it to, given, and there was a lot of thought put into the design, but there were some questions, legitimate questions about the overall effectiveness and wanting to make sure that it was working as best as possible, right? So we came in and supported some learning through 3 different approaches. So in-person usability testing of the ICT itself, right? We did some very small scale A/B testing of the content of the SMS, so of the messages that were being sent to teachers. So we did some testing of different formulations of the content to make sure that it was interpretable by people and as easy to interpret as possible, right? And then we did semi-structured interviews over the course of a couple of weeks with the key actors. And after a few weeks of field work and doing this, we found that teachers and principals were able to use the SIM cards, receive the messages, and connect with other Ministry of Education staff, right? we weren't able to identify if teacher practices changed as a result. And this was this was the design, right? We weren't planning to look at teacher practices. We really just wanted to see if people could use the tools. And then the recommendations that came from this were around content and structure, right? And the preferred timing for delivery of the SMS. So we did learn about the actual formulation of the wording in the messages, the structure of them, when teachers wanted to be receiving them, right? Thinking about during the day versus after the school day, right? Management of these SIM cards and making sure that they everybody knew where everything was and was being used, and then figuring out ways to track connectivity or receipt of SMS in a context where not everybody has data all the time. It's important to know if some teachers are actually getting the messages that they should be getting or not, and what does it take for them to do that. And then the idea of formalizing networks for virtual communication amongst the MOE staff came out of this, because teachers were often connecting with each other, connecting with their trainers, and there's a chance for some exclusion, right? If there's a teacher that wasn't there the day of the training and they don't get connected up, want to make sure that everybody has equal access to all information. So this helped with adaptation. And the program actually took this to heart and made some improvements to implementation as a result. So the second RCE is around coaching of teachers, right? So teachers were being asked to implement a new curriculum, and so they received training, and then they received a series of coaching and support from different actors in the system throughout the school year to do this. And so the question that the program had was really around the most effective approach to coaching teachers, right? You can do things virtually, you can do things in person. What is the right dosage? What is the right amount, and why? And what is it that teachers need in order to implement this new curriculum? So we conducted a two-phase study. So the first phase was around qualitative research of barriers and facilitators to coaching, really talking with teachers, coaches, so that's school directors, inspectors, and other actors at the regional levels, right, to understand what the barriers of delivering coaching, receiving coaching, and the facilitators there. In phase two, we then were able to conduct a small sample RCT, basically in one region, right, to test 3 different models against each other to be able to generate some evidence around sort of the cost effectiveness of the models, like what could be scaled across the country and sustained by the ministry later on, because there's different models that can work, right? In person versus virtual coaching, they're different. They help teachers, right? Both of them can help teachers, but is one better than the other? Is one more cost effective than the other? So we did this study to look at satisfaction and usefulness of the different models, right? So both perceived as well as measured by teacher practices. The RCT also looked at implementation of each model to understand if all the models could be implemented very well, and then sustainability, right, in terms of feasibility of implementation, right, logistics, policies, costs. And we found that there was a really strong appreciation for supplemental coaching, whether it's in person or virtual. We called it telecoaching. Supplemental coaching of both types did result in improved teacher practices. And the teacher practices were best among those who received the additional in-person coaching, right? It was 1 session per month from a coach that lived nearby that came to support them. And that really supported their practices. However, when you look at the costs, the virtual coaching was more cost effective. So there's a decision, right? The policymakers need to take here to think about, well, what can we do? And so our recommendations that came from this was to blend the coaching model to include both supplemental in-person and virtual coaching, and to test at a larger scale. We did this study at the very end of the 5-year contract. And so this was sort of what we'd left the ministry with. And what we understand, we were right in the middle of the pandemic, early in the middle of the pandemic for this. And so nothing was done right away with this information, but then we understand that last year, I believe, the ministry decided to bring in virtual coaching at a larger scale to look at that and to see if they could carry that out. So the information was used. All right, the third RCE, and then I'll stop talking, is around engagement of the community and parents, right, of the kids that are in school. So the learning questions were related to whether or not these community engagement activities that the project was was doing increased parents' involvement in children's reading in the house, right? And many of these parents are parents who are illiterate, who are not reading themselves. So the idea was for the project to support parents that both could read and couldn't read to support their children's reading. And then also, did this engagement improve teachers' knowledge, attitudes, and practices in teaching early grade reading? And did it improve children's reading skills? So the design for this was to do an RCT. 20% of the schools that were receiving this new curriculum also received this community and parent engagement. And the project had, from the very beginning, used random assignments with stratification by region to determine which communities would receive this additional set of activities. And so the project, it was, by the time the researchers came in, it was already set up for an RCT for us to use, which was really, really nice. But it's because USAID and the project had thought that they would probably want to do a study on community engagement, right? Like they knew that they had a question about this and they were planning that eventually a study would be done. So we were able to do that. We used programmatic data. So the AGRA that was being collected by the project, the CAPS, the teacher knowledge, attitudes, and practices studies to answer this question. And we were able to work with the project to increase their sample size in their AGRA and their CAP that they had already planned to be able to just increase the sample size a little bit so that way we could do this RCT and have a little bit more confidence in the power. We were still worried about the statistical power of the study, right? Our ability to draw conclusions based on the sample size. And so we planned for and conducted a Bayesian analysis, which has several advantages when you're thinking about bringing the data together and making decisions and generating actionable evidence based on the data that you have. We also used qualitative research to understand barriers and facilitators to implementation and gain a deeper understanding of the results, right? So from this study, we found that there were meaningful positive impacts across multiple domains, including parental attitudes and engagement in reading and parental interactions with teachers, as well as with student decoding. So one of your earlier steps in literacy, right? Although not all. So not all of the outcomes we looked at had positive impacts or the impacts in the direction you would want. So there were some mixed effects on teacher practices. And we have some hypotheses on why, but we're not really sure why. So I'm not going to go into that there. And then in terms of recommendations from this, we saw that the implementation of the different activities in the communities was not the same for all the communities because you have different actors and different folks doing things differently, right? So thinking really about making sure that everybody and how all the communities can get the full implementation could be useful. And then the role of the community mobilizers. These are actors in the communities that are doing a lot of the engagement, direct engagement with the communities and with the parents is really important. And they received some funding to reimburse for expenses incurred, but we think that that funding piece is really critical to making sure that the community mobilizers are able to do what they've been asked to do across all of the communities that they work with. And we did this study over after 8 to 10 months of implementation. So basically one school year. And then as a result of that, the project and USAID could then take the learnings, make some tweaks and make some decisions about future funding. All right, last slide. Thank you for listening to me this whole time, but I just want to sort of pull all of this back together and say, okay, so when you're thinking about conducting a rapid cycle evaluation, or you're working with actors that are doing the rapid cycle evaluation, collaboration, I just want to sort of some of the key things, right? Key tips here. So collaboration between researcher, implementer, decision maker, and ministry is really important. So it's not, the researcher is not advisor that's coming in, or, you know, a bean counter, right? So we're judging the quality of the program here. No, the point is we want to work with you to think about what your questions are, why you have those questions, and let's work together to generate evidence. And so having this open flow of information is incredibly important. So that way the researcher can be design a study that's going to be useful and actionable by those that have to make decisions from the data. The learnings that are generated from the rapid cycle evaluation really must be accessible and relevant to decision makers, right? It's not, oh, this study had a statistically significant effect on this, right? No, it's here's the effect, this is the magnitude, and this is why, right? It has to be accessible. People have to be able to interpret and understand, and it really needs to be relevant so that way people can make decisions. So the choice of what outcomes you're looking at, the study design, all of that stuff is really important, so that way you can have a really relevant fit for purpose study. Doing a rapid cycle evaluation is really most useful when the program can adapt as a result of the study, right? The modifications that you suggest from the study that you find, this should be feasible, right? It should be a possible thing to do, and the implementing partner should be willing to adapt it. Otherwise, why do the study here, right? So you really want to make sure that in thinking through the problems and the questions, making sure they're very relevant to the implementing partner, so that way they can so that way the study is useful and can be used, the findings can be used. And we need to be thinking very carefully about these short-term outcomes, right? Coming back to the theory of change, right? We must be able to measure the outcomes that we're interested in, one, and we must they must be able to change in a short term, whether it's a couple of months or maybe a school year, but it should be reasonable to expect a change in outcomes as a result of the intervention. So when we are doing this RCE to generate evidence, right? We don't want to measure something that, well, we wouldn't have expected it to change for a couple of years anyways. Well, okay, then why do the study? There's not any information you can glean. So if you're thinking about longer term outcomes that maybe you can't measure in the short term, right? But you still want to do a study related to it, you really got to come back to that theory of change and think through, well, what are the more approximate outcomes? What is that first outcome or output, even if you want to look at that, right? That could be measured to support decision making for the project. Again, iteration can be helpful. Sometimes you learn a piece and then you want to learn some more, or maybe you make a tweak and then you want to make another tweak as a result of it. And then I think at the end of the day, pragmatism here is really important, right? We don't want to let perfection be the enemy of the good. I'm an economist, maybe a 95% confidence when I'm doing my statistical analysis is where I'm most comfortable. Maybe I'm comfortable here with an RCE, it's smaller scale. Maybe we can use a 90% level of confidence, or maybe we can think, you know, about a smaller sample size and not necessarily look at the full population, but look at a portion of it so we can just make some decisions and then later on do a bigger study, right? So pragmatism, I think, is really important here to generate evidence. Okay, thank you very much. I really appreciate your taking the time to listen to me talk. And so I'll stop and open it up to questions and comments.
Emilie, thank you. That was fantastic. Let me begin our discussion with, there are a number of things in chat, but Flavio, who's on the screen with us, put something in about countries you're working in Brazil. But I have a question that links what you just presented with what Flavio often talks about with us. And he focuses on improvement science. And it struck me that the improvement science approaches bear some similarities to rapid cycle evaluation. So maybe, I don't know, Flavio, if you wanted to refine that question for Emilie or just have Emilie respond to that.
Thanks, Mike. Emilie, congratulations on your work. I just put another question. I've been very selfish. I put another question in the chat, which ties to what Mike is just said. So our approach to continuous improvement. So I came from industrial engineering environment. So I'm an engineer by education, but I got pretty passionate about social work, social justice, social impact. So I came to Penn, and I have graduated with Mike on a counseling program. But my background is industrial engineering, where all continuous improvement came from. And I was so happy that I saw a lot of continuous improvement initiatives on education. And that's what Mike and I and the team are doing in our project for mental health. So one challenge that we have that we didn't have, for instance, in corporate, is the question that I just put in the chat. So what do you think would be a good balance between the academic and the statistical power or the statistical rigor? But at the same time, this should be something that policymakers and decision makers should understand and digest, right? So in corporation, we don't have that side because executives, they don't have academic background, so they don't question statistical power. But whenever you're in education, there must be a lot of pushback. So what do you think would be the right balance? And that ties to your last slide, right? It should be meaningful. It should be very understandable by the decision makers. So how to balance those two things, which is the rigor of being a practitioner scholar, but at the same time giving input for decision makers to get a decision based on data that they can understand?
Yeah, thanks for your question. I appreciate it. And I would like to say that I am also an engineer by training. That's how that's my undergraduate degree. And then I went and got the PhD in economics because I was interested in applying the thinking, right? The problem solving in the social sciences like you. So my graphic that I had, it was a little messy, right? I think I was trying to show sort of a little bit about this balance. And I think at the end of the day, it comes back to the stakes of the decision. Right? So if we want to show this program was, had an effect, you funders should make sure you fund it for, until the end, expand it to scale, go do more, right? I think at that point, you might want a more rigorous, larger sample, right? Everything should be rigorous and well done, right? But maybe a larger sample, so that way you can be more confident that the conclusions that you're drawing are really pertinent to the population that you're interested in. When it's about a tweak of a program, and it's just like, it's almost like the idea is to put structure to something that is probably naturally happening on the project already. We're rolling out this ICT, okay? We're gonna deliver SIM cards to everybody. We're gonna be sending messages, right? The program, the actors know what the best approach is, what they wanna do. But as they're doing it, they're saying, well, wait a minute, we're not actually sure what the right decision is here. Let's try this maybe, let's try this. You can bring a structured approach to that, so that way you can generate learning that you're much more confident in and move yourself forward a little bit more quickly, I think, right? And so I think that it really comes back to the stakes of the decision, the scale, and the context. And so every place is going to be a little bit different. And every program is going to be a little bit different. The availability of data can also inform this, because if you have programmatic data that are available that you can use to do your study, great, you have a large sample and you can do that. If you don't, and you don't have the budget to collect a large sample of data, well, maybe you do something at smaller scale to be a proof of concept that you can then take and knowing what you found and understanding the design and being clear about what the design is, its strengths and its shortcomings, can then help with that next layer of decision making. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's very thoughtful.
Yeah.
Looking forward to talk more about it.
Yeah. And I'm seeing Amy. Hi, Amy, your comment here on the distinction between implementation science and RCE. If you go to our chapter, we have like a table, like a little box really early on, because I think that there's a lot of words that folks use in different fields to talk about the same idea here, right? And so the way that I think about this is when we think about evaluation, right? And what are we doing with evaluation? Let's think about it in a shorter term and a more rapid cycle to improve the quality of implementation. And let's think about testing, right? So let's do something and test it and study it and try something different. sometimes as we're implementing, we're tracking and we're learning and we're doing, right? And then we're iterating, but are we actually implementing a test or not? And so to me, that's sort of like where this rapid cycle evaluation framing, I think, is helpful, because the idea is we're stepping up and saying we don't know and we want to do a test and we want to learn from it. But I think that, yeah, you can, terminology, yes, it all fits in the same bucket, I think.
Amy, do you want to follow up with that response? Or is that cut it for you?
I think that's good. And that I was going to write down that question that you said, Emilie, of are we actually implementing a test or not? Because I think for me, and I work at an implementing organization, IREX, so we are not academic researchers. We do conduct some research, but we also implement and we do monitoring evaluation. And one of the use cases of this type of work is really for our conversations with governments, as we're talking about the impact of what we're doing together and whether or not they're seeing the results of what we're doing together. But I would say sort of we do a lot that's a little bit of one level of formality down, even from what you're talking about, Emilie, which is more of the pause and reflect sessions. We might have one-on-one interviews or focus groups with teachers. We do less of the A/B testing. I'd like to do a little bit more of that, but I often find, especially when you're in an organization that hasn't flexed this muscle a ton, that it can become overly involved and costly fast, especially if the expectations are not set up really well ahead of time with everyone involved in getting the information. They may expect a different level of rigor than what's planned and budgeted and all those pieces. Great conversation.
So, Parnika, I see that you have to get off the Zoom call. Give a minute to ask your question, or we may have lost her. Oh, I think we lost her. She had a number of comments in chat, Emilie, including access to the chapter that you presented on. Or even the book. So how would people access that?
Yeah, so I think Jackie put the link to the chapter in the chat. You can go, the handbook itself is available for purchase in hardcover, or you can get access to the electronic version, and through most of your institutions, you probably have access to these. I have the chapter itself, so I'm happy to share with some folks about it. I'm not supposed to send it and post it up myself, but if you reach out to me, I'm happy to share some of the details.
So maybe Jackie can do that, although she might have it already since she has that link.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure. Anyone else on the Zoom call have a question you'd like to pose to Emilie, or a comment about the presentation? Before I have a number of things in mind as well, but
Mike, I just want to ask about Latin America. Emilie, what countries were you guys able to work with? I'm asking because, very selfish, I'm Brazilian, so I would love to.
So Mathematica and globally writ large has worked in Peru, in Nicaragua, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Dominican Republic. I think a few more.
Do you speak Spanish?
I do.
Yes, I see from your accent, your perfect accent.
Yeah,
on Nicaragua.
Nicaragua, not Nicaragua, right?
Yeah,
I try.
That's very rare
right.
in US to get it right.
Yes,
awesome, thank you. I just want to take too much of your time.
Sure.
That's awesome.
Emilie, let me read Amy's comment, because this is being recorded and we can send the recording to Amy, even though she had to jump off. I know she was very engaged in your talk. So, evidence for decision making. If new pedagogical approaches are being introduced in training, using RCE to get info about which pedagogical approach teachers are actively applying in the classrooms post-training and which they aren't. Do you follow that question?
Yes. And we are planning for or hoping for doing some work related to that question in Liberia on a project where Mathematica is a sub to Chemonics as the learning partner there. The idea being, look, we know what teacher practices, like if teachers are engaging in practices that we want them to be engaging in, right? Maybe we need to do a study to figure that out. And then saying, okay, let's train the teachers on specific practices and then see what happens, right? So at what point do you measure and look at teacher practices, and how do you do that, right? So we've got to think about the right tool for classroom observation, the right actors to doing that, and then thinking through when we should be measuring it. I would say when you're thinking about rapid cycle evaluation and thinking about teacher practices, you should probably also not just think about practices, but think about the other factors affecting the teachers. So in Liberia, the theory of change is built around the COM-B approach: capability, opportunity, motivation. You have to have all of those in place to engage in the behavior. So maybe we should, before we spend the time and energy to observe practices, maybe we should do some more shorter, more rapid interviews, surveys to understand whether or not teachers have the knowledge, right, have the opportunity to engage in the behavior. And so, and at what point do you do that? And that, I think, really is dependent on the program and rollout of implementation. Because if, let's say, there is training at the beginning of the school year and then a refresher training in the middle of the school year, maybe you want to do that study before that refresher training. At that point, if you don't have time to do observational observations, maybe you can do some surveys, right, a little bit more quickly. Maybe you do have time to do the observations, right? And you can gather some information to inform that next phase of that refresher training. And then maybe again at the end of the school year to inform the following school year. So it's going to depend on resources, obviously, on both budget as well as human resources and folks' availability to do this. And then the use of the data, right? Because we want to collect the data and have it analyzed in time for a key moment in decision making, and rollout is really important there.
Amy, I realized you hadn't jumped off. So sorry to co-opt your question.
All good. And it wasn't quite in the chat or in the presentation. Emilie had asked about kind of use cases that we saw, and I was answering that question in that comment. So it wasn't necessarily a question, but actually super interesting to hear what you're doing in Liberia, and that's very relevant to a couple of things we're doing. So it was great that it was turned into a question, even though that wasn't how I initially intended it.
Great.
It's glad it was helpful.
Question.
So Emilie, let me give you, I put something in chat earlier. I want to make sure others, Bruce, do you want to mention your comment or question in chat?
Mike, thank you, Emilie. I really appreciate just the back and forth you had with Flavio. I find it was very interesting. My name is Bruce. I'm working with Mike as a research associate with GPN, and the way how you mentioned about getting evaluations inputs, I just find this resonation with failing fast, right? Just finding optimized ways to get inputs. I see this happening in various processes, entrepreneurship, as well as product development. I don't see any academic work differently than putting a entrepreneurship project out in the market. So that's why I pride myself in, as I studied under Mike, to really bridge entrepreneurship with things we teach at GPN for the possibility mentoring and development. So, but I just want to point it out, you just hit a spot in terms of failing fast, optimizing the decision-making cycle, and getting the feedback quickly. Really appreciate the work you do. So.
If I can just add a comment there, this idea of failing fast and the industry that that I work in, right? I'm often hired as the independent evaluator, right, at Mathematica. And so sometimes when I'm brought in, it feels, I think, or I perceive on the implementation partner side that I'm judging the quality of their work, right? And I think that it's not, I think there's a reason for that, right? And I think that funders, regardless of what funder we're talking about here, should make sure to be open to the idea and should appreciate it when implementing partners, when those that are doing the implementation, working with the ministry, are open to learning, right? And are open to showing, look, this didn't work, let's try something different. I think oftentimes contracts, the way they're set up, sometimes can be a challenge, right? Because you got to meet your targets, you got to get, do what you said you would do. So I think this openness to failing and to talking about it, I think we see this, right? Even in publications, right? Oftentimes studies that have no effect aren't published, right? So like, I think that we just openly, all of us together, the community, need to find a way, right? And it's on the funder side, on the implementer side, on the research side too, right? Those that are doing the research, we need to be very careful about how we talk about the findings, right? And I really appreciate the openness. Anytime I work with anybody that's doing this iteration and willingness to learn from studies that we do, I think I'm really appreciative when they're able and willing to talk about it openly.
Emilie, what are the risks of misinterpreting failure? Like when we talk about failing fast, what if it's not a failure, but it's a step in the right direction and we misinterpret that and change directions? Do you think about that in this work?
I have not had that experience yet, but I think that when I do think about it in the sense that the study design is really, it's always really important to keep in mind how big is my sample, how rigorous, how confident am I in the findings that we have, okay? And so I'm very careful to qualify and to make sure that the people that are using the information that we're sharing understand, look, we did this in this region or at this size, right? And so my recommendation for you is not coming back to that virtual versus in-person coaching. The recommendation wasn't in-person coaching all the way or virtual coaching all the way because it's more cost effective. It's think about what's going to work better in your context, do it at a little bit larger scale and do a little bit more studying, right? Because I think that you really need to keep track, right? And we don't ever want to just say, okay, we know the answer and then we're done. Especially not with rapid cycle evaluation, because the purpose is to try and to iterate and modify and then look again. And maybe we did make the wrong decision, so let's go this way. Or maybe it wasn't perfect, so let's tweak it this other way.
Right. So sometimes I refine that language in my own understanding of things as learning fast, because there's some failures and some successes in the things we do. But so we need tweaks, but. And this is something that has I've struggled with a little bit with the improvement science approaches we use. That because we often see in schools that things change, one thing changes after another, and teachers get frustrated that we have a new approach coming in now because we think it's better than the old approach, but the old approach might not have had time to really take hold. So seems complex to me.
But can I just make a quick comment? Knowing just because sometimes I know Emilie, you, yourself, and many participants here that are expert in the industry. Sometimes we are kind of cursed by this expertise and expert knowledge, right? So we think, things we say are if we lack of the criticalness to reevaluate our work, sometimes to work with industries, that can be really detrimental. But I find the openness point you made, Emilie, was really critical for those things to happen, because failing fast is also meaning that you are being open. So there's a critical thinking component, which is being an expert. This openness is facilitating the feedback. Along with the cycle, there's a Venn diagram you can put into the between. That's where the learning is happening in the space of being open and being critical. And I didn't coin this finding that was published by Adam Grant. I find this social media post really interesting, but I just find it resonating to what he just talked about here. So I want to share that just when Mike was talking. So thank you.
And Mary Faith, let's make sure we get you in. You want to share what you put in chat or expound upon that a bit for Emilie?
Sure. Hi, Emily.
Hi.
I just was, let's see, I was just saying that, I think something you said just before this last exchange, about, it just got me, this is what we've been thinking about a lot. I mean, we at Intersect are often in the position of, being on a project as a subcontractor that's heading up a lot of different types of studies, but a lot of them have to do with assessment systems that we're helping the government develop. And so we're working with a suite of local actors over time, trying to, go through a very sound research process and have, often nationally representative data that we can, work with them with. And it also sometimes is district level assessment systems we're helping develop. And so, but what we find is that sometimes the teacher training component is a bit, I don't want to, I mean, okay, we could use the term siloed or however, but there's another subcontractor working hard on that. And that is so instrumental really to what we're working on, but yet it's kind of in a different category, and they might be quote piloting, but we can't really determine what they're really learning from their piloting, and so to be able to really capture that using useful research approaches that would really help inform the intervention and could be supplementary to the work we're doing that are kind of the more official studies of the project that need to be done. So, I mean, that's just something we've been thinking about. And Emily, you now in Liberia, for example, are in a similar position that we've been as a sub to Chemonics on a lot of other projects like in Senegal and other places. Mm-hmm. And currently we're doing a lot of work in Malawi, for example, district level assessment systems, national assessment systems, pre-primary piloting, but the teacher training piece is sort of separate, but we try to know what they're doing. Okay, now when are you doing training? Okay, what are you doing in the training, so that our instruments at least are relevant to what they're doing in the training. But anyway, that's just, I think what you said, Emily, made me think about that. So
yeah. I will say, so this Liberia project, we're very early on in the program, and we are a part of the MERL team, right? So there's the MERL lead, but it's the MERL team. And so we've been from the very beginning working, even at the time of the proposal, thinking about the collaborate, learn, and adapt, right? CLA in the USAID world, right? But it's this iterative approach, adapt as you go kind of thing, thinking about, well, what should we be measuring and how do we connect across all of the different activities that are happening on this big project that's got crazy deadlines, really high expectations about what can be achieved and when, and making sure that the different folks that are doing different things connect and understand how their different results, are interconnected. Right. And so I think that this open dialogue and collaboration across the project and making sure to take the time to pause and reflect, right? Putting that in the budget, putting that in the work plan, making sure it's there in the work plan, right? I think is it's going to be really, really useful as we move through the project and figure out what the overall learning agenda is, what the sub learning questions are as we develop the RCEs we want to conduct over time there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great.
Hey, Emily, I'm just looking at making sure we're not missing anything in chat, but one of the comments you made that struck me as particularly important to some of the work we do here with possibility mentoring, where we're helping youth conceive of possibilities in their lives and then pursue them through mentoring support or other forms of support, is the identifying measurable proximal goals or proximal targets. So if your real focus is longer term, something you want to accomplish in the long term, how do you identify what the more proximal steps are toward that long-term goal? Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, the theory of change, right? I think it's incredibly important to do a detailed theory of change. Oftentimes we'll see a theory of change, and it's if we support the ministry, then we'll have, improved practices, then we'll see improved learning, right? That's very valuable, right? But then going to the next layer or even 2 layers down and saying, okay, if we do this particular activity, right, what are the outputs, the short-term outcomes that are going to come of it? And what are the assumptions behind that, right? We're assuming that teachers are able to take in yet another new methodology, even though they got something a year ago, right? Like we're assuming that they've got the bandwidth, the capacity to learn this thing, to apply this thing, to do this next thing, right? And sitting down and having that conversation even is useful, I think.
Yeah.
And bringing your different actors together on the project to just have the conversation can help crystallize and clarify some things. But then what do we measure, right? What are the outcomes? What is going to happen with youth right away, later on? And that's where other social sciences, I think, come in and can inform us, right? Or the experts, the subject matter experts in youth and their development and change, right? Maybe we just want to measure engaging, right? Just engagement in something, right? Specific engagement, and then saying, okay, well, is it happening? If not, and then doing some interviews with folks and understanding why, right? What's going on there, and then go and measure from there. I don't know, maybe you have in the psychology field, right? We know that in order to see this bigger change that's going to happen later, some other things have to change earlier, and we can measure them. And maybe those measures are qualitative, and that is okay. We do not need everything to be a quantitative index or indicator that we can track on a graph over time. Maybe we really do need to do some more qualitative work in some of those interim steps before we can then go on and measure that ultimate change that we want to see.
Yeah, what we the way we use qualitative work in some of our efforts is to try to capture what's actually going on in these early stages of an intervention, for example, or an implementation project of some type, because we're sometimes measuring even proximal targets without knowing what's leading to them potentially. So we're using qualitative work to understand what the more effective practices are earlier in an implementation process.
Exactly. And if you do that and you can put it in that theory of change, right, then we can all learn from it, right, and bring that right. Oftentimes I think some of this sits in the experts' heads or in a a paper that is maybe not accessible, or it is accessible to me, but I just don't know to find it, right? And so I have to go talk to the subject matter experts about it. And those are often the folks in the field, right, doing the work. They know, right? You know what you're doing, right? And then I can help you figure out what to measure and how to measure it and why.
Right.
All right.
Andrew, I don't know. Who was that jumping in? Go for it, whoever it was.
Well, I was just going to say, so we are wrapping up at 12:15. So if we have time for one more brief question, or if Andrew has a comment or a question.
Go on the road. I've enjoyed it very much. Followed the whole thing. Yeah, it's been wonderful, Emily. Thank you so much for time and effort today. I think we've all enjoyed it. Thank you.
Andrew, your longer term driving goal needs to be to get safely to where you're going. And your proximal goal needs to be to pay careful attention to the road. Emily, thank you. Just to reiterate what Andrew said, and this leaves me with so many questions and connections to work that many of us are doing here. My last question for you, in wrapping up, for academics who are trying to publish things for their work, do you see the kind of work you're doing show up in academic journals?
Oh, this is a question that's so I've been with Mathematica for 13 years, and I cannot tell you how many reports I've written. The number of publications I have as a result of that is embarrassingly low.
Yeah.
So I am trying really hard, and this is a goal of mine, to take this work that should and could be published and get it properly published. but I am, I definitely need to work through that. Now, that said, so that's right. So is the work there, right? I mean, I absolutely am doing literature reviews all the time, right? And looking for materials and work. I think that there could be more, absolutely, but you certainly find these kinds of studies out there. They do exist.
Yeah, the reason I asked the question is because I think these rapid cycle evaluations that show us the effectiveness of short-term processes is extremely important, but it tends not to get published because it's part of a larger evaluation process. And what typically gets published is the long-term stuff. But this interim stuff is so critical, and I think we ought to all do what we can to help it get out into the academic community a little more.
You can look in the gray literature. There are some funders, right, that do this kind of work, right? That have it there. So,
Emilie, thank you again. Jackie, any last words for us?
This has been awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for attending, and we will upload this to our YouTube channel.